Good morning. My name is Dr. Shah, for those of you that may not be familiar with me, and I want to welcome each and every one of you to the very first lecture that we are delivering here on what I like to think of as our medical campus, since our medical offices are right next door. And I know that weekends are valuable time, and you've taken some of that time to come and listen to me speak. I hope that it will be to your benefit. But whether it ends up being that way or not, I'm very appreciative that you've taken your time to come here. Kayla Shelley, who is with her twins in the back corner of this space, she and I run a internal medicine primary care practice here. And we've been doing it a while. I've been doing it a little bit longer than Kayla. So I'm pushing now about 22 years of providing internal medicine primary care for thousands of patients, both on the East Coast, where I was before we relocated here to Arizona. The reason why I have taken my Saturday to prepare a lecture and share it with you all is because I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated with the hamster wheel that I find myself on during regular office hours. I'm frustrated with the narrowness of the window that I have in order to be able to try to help a patient. And increasingly, the role of healthcare providers like myself and Kayla is less to be an advisor, less to be a teacher, and to more to just be a transactional technician. And in that transaction, a patient presents, a patient offers a set of complaints, and we as technicians have somewhere between 7 and 12 minutes to manage those complaints and usually offer some sort of a pharmaceutical in order to treat that complaint. And that's the cycle, rinse and repeat. And as healthcare providers, we're supposed to do that if we're going to stay alive and viable 32 times a day. So 4 patients an hour. And Kayla and I try our best to do that, but increasingly we found that there are just some things that need to be explained in more detail. There are conversations that require a deeper dive into the subject matter, and we simply weren't being given the opportunity to do that. And so we began to talk about creating a space, and as you can see, this is literally still under construction. But there aren't a lot of doctor's offices that will go ahead and rent a second space where the only purpose of that is to conduct teaching. But we've made that commitment. And in this space, what we want to do is create an environment where we can take a deep dive, spend an hour talking about a subject that I perhaps couldn't cover in depth, and Kayla can't cover in depth in an exam room. And so that's what we're here to do. Those of you that are patients of mine have probably already gotten an inkling that I'm a bit passionate about the human gut microbiome. Those are the organisms, and there's trillions of them that exist in our gut and play a profound relationship with our well-being and even the ways that we manifest disease. Another thing, if you're a patient of mine, that you'll have probably already have heard me say at least once, is that one of the frustrating things about my career, as I've viewed it in hindsight, is that too many of my colleagues, and early on, me, myself as well, I feel are guilty of essentially becoming glorified Pez dispensers for the pharmaceutical industry, where it's almost as if the only way that we know how to practice is through studies that have been literally created for us by the pharmaceutical industry. And those studies tell us that the way to treat any given disease is with a particular drug. And it's usually a branded drug, which means it has a patent on it and it's expensive. Some of the drugs that we're going to talk about today that treat mental illness, they're all literally billion-dollar drugs. That's billion with a B. These are dollar amounts that are unfathomable. That's $1,000 million that a drug makes every year. But that's the kind of healthcare network that we currently are working within. And so the second reason why I'm here on a Saturday morning is because It's my way of protesting the idea that a healthcare provider is essentially nothing more than a glorified Pez dispenser for the pharmaceutical industry. We are not that. I will not accept that as the role that I serve. I'm the son of a teacher, and while he is here today as a retired calculus teacher, I know how powerful teaching someone can have an impact on their lives. And I've always believed that as a healthcare provider, that one of my primary purposes is to teach and to empower my patients with knowledge that will allow them to practice their own self-healing. And so we'll have a true partnership, okay? With this in mind, I've already delivered a lecture at another venue. It happened to be the home of Dr. Jamal Attallah, who is also here in attendance, who's a nephrologist, and he and I share, in many ways, similar worldviews about how healthcare should be delivered and the values that it should advance. And I gave a kind of a broad overview of what the human gut microbiome is and its role within human health, and some of the ways that it has become dysfunctional, a term or a condition that is described with a term called dysbiosis, okay? But today's conversation is about a narrower focus, and that focus is how does the human gut microbiome, the trillions of organisms that live within our gut, how do they engage us and affect our mental well-being? And specifically, I'm focusing on anxiety and depression. And I've created a slideshow here that I want to get started. The title of this slide is biome, and I want to define some basic terms so that we're all at least on the same page. A biome is a very complex amalgamation of ecosystems that occur in a particular space. So the biomes that we know are, for example, the tundra. The tundra is a biome that there's a variety of ecosystems that exist within it, where organisms, both animals and plants, have developed some sort of interactive, co-balancing relationship. Another one is a tropical rainforest. A lot of us think of biomes like the Amazonian rainforest. Well, that would be a biome, okay? So there's a variety of biomes that we can all think about, depending on our level of interest with nature. But then there's a second kind of a biome, which is the human gut microbiome. Now, the term micro suggests clearly that it requires a microscope to visualize this, and that's the important distinction. So we have biomes around us that are macro, we can see them with the naked eye, but we also have within us and on us entire complicated ecological systems that exist. And the human gut microbiome contains nearly 100 trillion bacteria, viruses, and protozoa. That is a number that you cannot fathom. It is just an astonishingly large, varied population of organisms. They number roughly 10 times the number of human cells that exist. So they outnumber us nearly 10 to 1. Now, a lot of this data is in flux, and so I tell this to you today, and next year the data may suggest that the ratio is slightly different. But suffice it to say that this is a large population of organisms that exist within us. And I think it's time that we stop thinking of ourselves as simply, well, I am who I am. No, we are a complex system that houses a variety of organisms. Some of them we identify as self, but the majority of them are actually non-self, and they are stakeholders in who we are and also within our health. There's thousands of species, some estimate around 3,600, but just last week out of Australia, 100 new species of organisms, of bacteria were identified in the gut. And you might say to yourself, how are we still struggling with this? Well, we're struggling with it because typically the only things that we could identify were the things that we can culture. If we couldn't culture it, we couldn't identify it. Fortunately now, because of the use of special DNA probe technologies, we're able to not perhaps directly identify the organism in a petri dish, but we can identify it based upon its DNA profile. And those techniques are labor intensive, they're also costly, but they're being advanced, and as a result of that, literally every week, new species of organisms are being identified. And this is very, very exciting, because once we develop the full compendium of what it is that actually resides within us, we're going to be able to do a lot more with regards to manipulating it in order to advance human health. And that's very exciting. Okay, what is the relationship of these organisms to us as hosts? Well, there's two generally types of relationships that these organisms form. One is a commensalistic one. So commensalism, let's talk about that very briefly. This is where these organisms benefit from us, but they do not do any harm to us, and they do not confer any benefit to us. So they're living in a system where they're doing well for themselves, a lot of their own needs are being met, but they're doing so without doing any harm to us, but also without doing any benefit to us. And then there's a second type of relationship, which is the one that used to be called symbiotic or symbiosis, and now the more vogue term is mutualism. This relationship is one that allows these organisms to exist and to benefit from them being a part of our body, but at the very same time, they're conferring benefit to us. So they also give us something tangible that improves our health, our well-being. And so both types of relationships exist between these trillions of organisms in our gut and we as the human host. So this dynamic relationship, whether it's commensalistic or whether it's mutualistic, this didn't happen overnight. These are relationships that have evolved over the millennia, since time immemorial, from the time that man first became a human being. From that time, this relationship has been evolving, and unfortunately, since post-World War II, some of that evolution has not been to our benefit, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The second point I wanted to make before I left this slide is that this is a very interesting passage. Where do these organisms come from? How did we get them? They're gifts from our mothers. It is literally matrilineally passed. Fathers have nothing to do with your gut flora. Somehow, and in the first lecture that I gave, I talked about just how complicated it's getting. We used to have this magical view that as the baby comes down the birth canal and gets lathered up with the bacteria that's found in mother's vagina, that somehow from there, magically at some point, baby ends up with gut flora. It's not quite that simple. We are now finding that mom transfers it through her placenta. She transfers it during the delivery of the baby through the birth canal, and she may also deliver it to baby through her breast milk. And so it's within that first year of life that mom completes the gift of giving you basically the starter pack of what it is that you need to form your own gut microbiome. The second component to this conversation that we're going to have is for everyone to understand that there is, in addition to these trillions of organisms that exist in our gut, there is an entire nervous system that exists dedicated to gut health, and it's called the enteric nervous system. And it's a pretty splendid thing. It is a network of neurons that begin from the mouth all the way down to the anus, numbering about 500 million, which is, by the way, 5 times the number of neurons in the human spine. This is an incredibly complex neurological structure that many scientists refer to as our second brain. And as the facts start open up about this, you'll start to realize that there's a lot of truth to the idea of referring to it as the second brain. And there's a fascinating relationship that it has to the brain that we carry in our skulls, okay? I want you to imagine that there's a massive cable that connects the brain that we have here to this enteric nervous system or brain that we have in our gut. And that massive cable is called the vagus nerve. When I was in medical school just a few decades ago, the belief was that this cable, this vagus nerve that connects the human brain in our skull to the enteric nervous system, that it was primarily something that barks out orders. It tells the enteric nervous system what to do. And that understanding has been profoundly altered in the last 25 years. Now we have discovered that the vagus nerve listens more than it speaks. In other words, the vagus nerve is actually taking data being generated by the second brain. These are the massive complex of neurons that line our gut. This vagus nerve is the cord that takes that information back to the brain. And for the purposes of today's conversation, that's a critical thing to begin to understand, is that there's a cable connecting whatever is happening neurologically in the gut directly to the brain up here. Interestingly, if you sever the vagus nerve, and now that cable that connects the two brains has been taken away, something fascinating happens, which is that the enteric nervous system continues to function independently. Let that sink in for a moment, because that's not true of anything else. You cut the connection between any neurologic structure and its connection to the brain, and it withers on the vine. And that's why stroke patients, and that's why people with spinal cord injuries end up with all kinds of catastrophic deficits. And yet here is a neuronal network that consists of 500 million neurons, incredibly complex, and yet it can function independently in the event of a catastrophic injury that damages the vagus nerve. With this framework in mind, that you have these trillions of organisms, you have the enteric nervous system, you have the vagus nerve, the large cable that connects that enteric nervous system to the brain up above, let's now start to dabble with what do we do about anxiety and depression. So first of all, let me give you some context. You know, each of us, with regards to our health, are oftentimes in a war of one. We just know what we're experiencing, we know what we've been diagnosed with, and we know how we're being treated. So I want to shed some perspective on mood disorders. And by mood disorders, I always refer to anxiety and depression. Well, in the average internal medicine practice throughout this country, a third of the patients who present to that office for health care are coming there in order to address a mood disorder. So I generally tell my patients that are suffering with something like this that look to your left, look to your right. Of the three of you, one of you is there for this, okay? And repeat that over and over again. So this is a condition, this is a challenge that as a primary care provider, I see, Kayla sees on a daily basis. It is, in fact, in many respects, essentially an epidemic. It is an epidemic of mood disorders that exist in our country. Okay, I want to talk about two neurotransmitters that negotiate how we feel. The first one is serotonin, and the second is dopamine. Okay? Serotonin is commonly described as the feel-good neurotransmitter. In a very simplistic way, the more of it you have, the more chill you feel. The less likely you are to get anxious, the less likely you are to get depressed. And the less of it that you have, the more likely you are to feel anxious or depressed. Okay? It's a very simplistic model, and there's certainly ways that we can indict that, but for the purposes of today's conversation, I think that's reasonable to have. Know that moving forward, because serotonin is going to come up again and again. The second important neurotransmitter with regards to mental health is dopamine. And think of dopamine as your reward neurotransmitter. It's the one that makes you crave things. It's the one that makes you want things, whether that's in terms of what you eat or how you are thinking sexually. All of these are ways in which your brain is just seeking a dopamine high. So when it gets the dopamine, it feels fulfilled. If it's lacking the dopamine, it's craving. Okay? Now, the pharmacology of how it is that we have been treating mood disorders in the primary care setting and frankly in the psychiatric setting essentially has revolved around a class of drugs known as the SSRIs. Okay? SSRIs are basically drugs that raise the level of serotonin in the brain. That's essentially what they... Let me say this. When I, as a physician, was first confronted with this class of drugs. And the way that doctors typically get confronted with a new class of drugs is that a very attractive pharmaceutical rep comes to your office, offers to buy you lunch or offers to take you out to dinner, and arranges some sort of an educational opportunity where hand-selected medical research literature is provided to you that explains the virtues and extols the virtues of that drug or that class. And the literature that I was provided with many years ago when these drugs were first manifested is that, Dr. Shah, this is very straightforward. Your patients that are anxious and depressed, all they have is a deficiency in serotonin. Let them take a medication that raises the level of serotonin and they're going to feel fantastic. What they didn't tell us at the time is that these drugs also change the way that the human brain and the neuronal networks contained within the brain communicate with one another. And that once we structurally begin to change the brain as a result of the chronic consumption of these medications, if for any reason we are asking the patient to stop, it's a pretty difficult mess. I've had patients say things to me like, Dr. Shah, you stopped my SSRI, and it's as if there is a little leprechaun in my mind with a hammer pounding on my head. I've had other patients say to me, there are literally electrical shocks that I'm experiencing as part of the withdrawal. And doctors don't often get the opportunity to express these sort of thoughts, but as a clinician, when you're sitting across from a patient telling you that, it is mortifying. A part of you is saying, my God, what have I done? What did I do to this poor woman or this poor man who, now that she wants to get off this medication, is having such difficulty doing it? Two of the side effects that make the SSRIs very unpleasant is they cause weight gain and they cause sexual dysfunction. Now, because our practice is only 2 years old here, patients have come to me from other providers already on an SSRI, and I ask them what are one of their biggest challenges. And more often than not, they'll tell me that their weight is one of their bigger challenges. And I'll ask them, well, how long have you been struggling with your weight? And they'll give me a window of time. And I'll say, and when did you begin the SSRI that you were on? And it matches perfectly. And I ask the patient, were you aware when you began this medication that one of its side effects was weight gain? And they look at me with eyes wide open. What? It causes weight gain? It does. And this is one of the conundrums that we as healthcare providers have to deal with all the time, is that a lot of the pharmacologic treatments that we have at our disposal have side effects that can make them very untoward. The other untoward side effect of SSRIs is sexual dysfunction, where patients that are on it feel better, they're no longer depressed, they're no longer anxious, but they're no longer able to engage in sexual activity, at least not to their satisfaction. Okay, so how does the gut microbiome have anything to do with how we feel with respect to anxiety and depression? So what we've discovered is that there are certain cells in that enteric nervous system, they're called enterochromaffin cells. They line the gut and they secrete serotonin in the gut. And what's surprising to learn, given how important serotonin is with respect to mood, that 85% of the serotonin made in the human body is made in the gut. And it's made in the gut to serve the needs of that brain, of that nervous system. And that's basically to enhance and normalize gut motility. So a deficiency in serotonin in the gut can cause constipation, and overactivity or excessive level of serotonin in the gut can actually cause explosive bowel movements, loose stools, abdominal distension and pain and cramping. So it's a balancing act that the enteric nervous system plays with serotonin. But here's where things get interesting. The enteric nervous system doesn't manufacture serotonin without the blessings of certain requisite bacteria that must exist in the gut. How that relationship is actually manifested is still a work in progress, but enough animal studies have been done, as well as some population-based studies, to make it clear that serotonin production and release in the gut is heavily dependent on certain bacteria being present in the gut in order to trigger and stimulate the release of this important neurotransmitter. The same principle applies to the release of dopamine in the gut, because the gut also drives much of its function through the usage of the neurotransmitter dopamine. So you have the brain up here, and that brain relies on both neurotransmitters profoundly in order to maintain mood quality, being free from anxiety and depression. And at the same time, you have the gut relying on the same two neurotransmitters in order to properly function. If that seems a little odd to you, it is. And the connection is far more profound than that, and I'll explain that to you in a moment. It comes back to that cable. Remember the cable nerve? The cable, the vagus nerve? The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve. I know that Kyle will appreciate that little bit of trivia. It's the 10th cranial nerve. But this large cable that connects the enteric nervous system to the brain up above, it is cataloging how much serotonin and how much of the dopamine is being generated in the enteric nervous system, in this second brain. And it's sending that information up to the brain in our skulls. And there, that brain begins to mirror the production of serotonin and dopamine as it's occurring in the enteric nervous system. So if you have a dysfunction of the production of serotonin and dopamine in the gut, you will, because of the connection that it has to the brain in our skulls, vis-a-vis the vagus nerve, you will begin to have a mirroring of that dysfunction in the brain. And as a result of that, if you have a deficiency in serotonin in the brain, or you have a deficiency in dopamine in the brain, you are not going to feel well. Emotionally, you're going to be very labile, you're going to be very prone to depression or anxiety. So is that the only way that the gut bacteria can kind of dictate how we feel, what our mood is? And the answer is no, we've just begun. A second way that gut bacteria have a profound role in terms of our mood is by mediating the levels of inflammation that exist locally in the gut and then systemically in the entire body. Inflammation is a theme. If you're curious about medical literature, you'll see it's running across the bands. Whether you're talking about heart disease, whether you're talking about cancer, whether you're talking about autoimmune disease, whether you're talking about rheumatologic diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, the underpinning to all of them is this notion of chronic inflammation in the body. It's the inflammation that in many ways may be the foundational aspect of human suffering and human disease. And now we're learning that chronic inflammation is profoundly affected by our gut ecology, by our gut bacteria. How do they do that? Well, one of the ways that we've discovered is that gut bacteria, one of the primary things that they do with regards to manufacture is they take the oligosaccharides, these are indigestible sugars that are found usually in plant life. So this is a part of the fiber that we eat, it's a part of the plants that we eat, and we're going to get to solutions later in this lecture. But a lot of those sugars, those indigestible sugars that we can't absorb ourselves, they are what gut bacteria then take and process into either short-chain fatty acids or long-chain fatty acids. And if they're making more short-chain fatty acids, guess what? The levels of inflammation go down. If they're making more long-chain fatty acids, guess what? The levels of inflammation goes up. So obviously, we want to have organisms in our gut that are, one, capable of producing short-chain fatty acids, and number two, we want to give them the substrate that they need in order to be able to do so. Both elements are necessary in order for the gut bacteria to create the short-chain fatty acids that we need, but these short-chain fatty acids should really be viewed as a hormone. And that's why increasingly researchers are looking at the gut microbiome not as a constellation of bacteria, but really more of an endocrine gland. Think of it like how we think of a pancreas or a pituitary or an ovary or a testicle, where we think of that purpose is primarily to secrete glands. Our research now is taking us to the precipice of where we are now regarding the human gut microbiome essentially as an endocrine gland that produces a series of chemicals or moieties like short-chain fatty acids that have profound effects on the body's overall inflammation and function. In order for you to understand where does that actually impact the human body's response to inflammation, in order for you to do that, you have to have this slide. Anytime you talk about inflammation, you have to talk about the HPA axis. The HPA axis is basically the interrelationship between your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your adrenal gland. These are a series of endocrine glands found in various parts of the body that interact with each other. And one of the end products of this HPA axis is to produce a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol in excessive amounts is a bad thing because it promotes inflammation. It promotes a state of stress. So, one of the things that you do not want is you do not want your HPA axis to be overactive. You don't want your HPA axis to be running on high. And I found this to be very interesting as I was combing the literature to prepare for this talk, that the single most prevalent commonality that is found in patients that are depressed across the world, across cultures, is that all of them have an overactive HPA axis. So this is actually the one common physiologic finding that we've been able to find in all patients afflicted with either depression or anxiety. And so this is a really important point in terms of our understanding of what is going on. And so, as the diagram attempts to illustrate, the kinds of compounds being manufactured at the level of the gut lining by that enteric nervous system, that second brain that we have, the kinds of molecules that it will manufacture is profoundly acting as a control on our HPA axis. And if that axis is given more short-chain fatty acids, then it is less likely to be overactive. And in fact, it has a calming effect, and the levels of cortisol are diminished in those patients. But if that HPA axis is not provided with this, along with other compounds that we're actively working on identifying, the end result is that the HPA axis begins to become hyper. And as that loop speeds up, cortisol levels in that patient go up, and the cortisol may in many ways be mediating both the serotonin and the dopamine metabolism in the brain of that patient. End result is they're suffering from anxiety and depression. When we were promoting this talk, I had done a brief video about toxoplasma. And toxoplasma is a tiny little protozoa that exists in basically all warm-blooded animals. There's at least 20 to 30% of the people in this room that have toxo in their gut. If you're a cat owner, the likelihood of you having toxo in your gut jumps up above 50%. And for some crazy reason, if you're a cat owner and you're French, it's 90%. It's the data. It is what it is. And toxoplasma is essentially an organism, a tiny little protozoa, whose ultimate dream is to somehow end up in a cat. And the reason for that is that it's the only warm-blooded animal system in which it can sexually replicate. But the problem is that it has a difficulty getting there. But where it doesn't have difficulty getting to is into the gut of mice. And that's where things really get fascinating with it, which is that once it gets into the gut of mice, it begins to change the way that that animal's memory functions, as well as the way that certain neurotransmitters are modulated in the brain of that mouse so that that mouse begins to lose its fear of cats. The latest literature, which I didn't include in my short little video on this, is that there are studies that now indicate that the mouse actually becomes sexually attracted to the cat. In other words, the toxoplasma somehow short-circuits the sex drive of the mouse and replaces the target of its affection from being another mouse to a cat. And as a result of that, these mice invariably end up in proximity of cats, where of course they're eaten. And once they're eaten, who's the winner? Toxoplasma. So the idea that these tiny little organisms have not evolved to have profound impacts on the behavior of their host would be naive. And we have not yet discovered an organism, at least within our gut microbiome, that plays such a profound role in our health or in our behavior. But if it were to happen, I would not be the least bit surprised. So know moving forward that we already have an example in the literature and in nature itself where a tiny little organism is essentially sacrificing a lesser host, the mouse, in order to get to its preferred host, even though in order to get there, the first host has to die. And so it really begs the question, how much of the dog wags the tail and how much of the tail is wagging the dog? And some of that is going to be applicable to us as well. How is it that we get into trouble? What is it about our organisms that reside in our gut that are causing changes in our mood? Why is it that anxiety and depression are so commonplace in modern life, both in America and elsewhere, but particularly in America? And the general term that I use to describe the underlying problem, and I used it earlier, is gut dysbiosis. And gut dysbiosis is basically where these microorganisms, these bacteria, and other creatures that live within our gut, and there's trillions of them, their balance with regards to their host has somehow become deranged. And the overwhelming, most common example of that I see in our practice is yeast overgrowth. Yeast overgrowth is basically the overgrowth of Candida albicans in the gut. And why would we have too much yeast in our gut? The most common explanation for that, the one that I kind of endorse, is the idea, first of all, of antibiotics. Antibiotics became prevalent right after World War II. By the early 50s, American ranchers and farmers had figured out that if you give livestock antibiotics, it has an anabolic effect on that animal. Anabolic means it grows bigger, faster. So it meant maybe you got another 100 pounds in every black Angus steer that you raised. Maybe you got another 50 pounds in every pig that you raised. Maybe you got another couple of pounds out of every chicken that you raised, provided you laced the food that you fed them with antibiotic. And that practice continues to today. And as a result, unless you're getting free-range meat that is ensured to be antibiotic-free, the meat that we consume, whether it's beef, poultry, pork, that meat is laced literally with antibiotic. And even though we cook the meat, and most of the antibiotic does become inactivated, there's always small amounts of active antibiotic that exist in that dish, in that food. This antibiotic then goes into your gut as you consume the food, and there it begins to exert an evolutionary effect, which is that it begins to kill off healthy bacteria that you want to keep. And as that real estate becomes available, other organisms that are not susceptible to the antibiotic take the opportunity to grow. The most common opportunistic member or actor is Candida albicans. And as a result of that, you have tremendous yeast overgrowth happening in the modern American gut. The second reason why antibiotics are so prevalent is because there's overprescribing of it. Phoenix is a town in which you cannot swing a stick without hitting an urgent care. I've never been in a town that had more urgent cares than the city of Phoenix. And every urgent care that you can go to in the city of Phoenix, we'll be more than happy to give you an antibiotic, whether what you have is viral or what you have is bacterial. It's just a matter of that's what you came there to get, and they're going to provide it to you. And they're not culpable alone. This is a nationwide phenomenon, which is that the overuse of antibiotics in the clinical setting. And that contributes to the problem of yeast overgrowth. The other thing that doesn't help us is that we have an obsession with refined sugars. And when we couldn't refine our sugars enough, we switched in the mid-'80s to high fructose corn syrup. Now keep in mind that your bacteria, just like you, had never been exposed to these kinds of refined sugars until we as humans created them. They do not exist in nature. There was never a time through the previous millennia where the bacteria ever had to deal with refined sugars and how powerful they were. Well, now that those refined sugars are readily available because of human production, it's having another profound effect on your gut flora. And once again, it's pushing for the yeast to win because yeast ferment. They make sugar into a variety of things, and they're very good at it. And so if you keep giving them refined sugars, they multiply faster in some instances than native species of bacteria, and as a result of it, they proliferate. Also, we have an absence of certain omega oils, namely omega-3 oils, because our diet is no longer rich in omega-3 oils. We're not eating the kinds of fishes that could give us that. We're not eating the kinds of nuts that can give us that. And as a result of that, a lot of the bacteria that had been accustomed to that coming through the pipeline, so to speak, they're not getting it, and they're being depleted. And again, other organisms that are not reliant on those omega oils, they are thriving, namely Candida albicans. What are one of the consequences of dysbiosis? Well, dysbiosis causes something called leaky gut syndrome. I remember 10 years ago where leaky gut syndrome was something considered voodoo medicine by most mainstream practitioners. That is no longer the case. Now you can open up the Lancet Journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and you will find articles that are talking about leaky gut syndrome and its consequences on human health. And basically what happens in leaky gut syndrome is that as a result of the dysbiosis, this is the overproliferation of certain species of organisms that do not belong in a healthy gut, as well as the decimation of certain species of organisms that do belong in the gut. That dysbiosis actually changes the way that the intestinal lining lets certain things in or not. The gates begin to open, and molecules and compounds, and even in some instances bacteria that are not supposed to get past that barrier into the bloodstream begin to do so. And that, as we'll see, has horrible consequences with respect to inflammatory bowel disease. Increasingly, we are now beginning to understand that patients that have Crohn's or ulcerative colitis may actually be manifesting a particularly severe version of leaky gut syndrome. But there's also strong scientific connections between leaky gut syndrome now and autism, depression, and anxiety. So the first solution that I want to address is probiotics. Now, probiotics come in two big flavors readily. One is supplements. All you have to do is go to Whole Foods or Sprouts, and you're going to see aisles and aisles dedicated to probiotics. And we're going to talk about them in some detail. But there's also fermented foods. One of the things that I find fascinating on this journey that I've been embarked upon with regards to trying to understand human gut health is that human beings have somehow always known about the importance of maintaining your gut flora. The Germans have sauerkraut. The Koreans have kimchi. The Greeks have their yogurt. The Turks do as well. I happen to have been born on the Indian subcontinent to parents that in my entire upbringing in the Midwest of this country would always tell me about the importance of eating yogurt. And they ate yogurt every day. And as an American kid in the 70s and 80s, I always found that a little strange. Like, why are my parents so obsessed with eating yogurt that they made at home? My mother would literally make her own yogurt in our oven. And sometimes deep wisdom takes a while to absorb. Because it wasn't until this stage of my career and of my life that I look back on that and I realized, look, whether my mom hailed from a village in the Punjab or whether she had a PhD from Berkeley, what she was pressing was just as profound. The importance of fermented food as a part of your diet cannot be overemphasized. I tell my patients that I believe are suffering from gut dysbiosis that they must have on a daily basis some form of fermented food, whether it's the kimchi, whether it's sauerkraut, or whether it's Greek yogurt, or some combination thereof. And I know that there's other variants like kombucha and kefir that you can also consume. But the point is these are all coming from established cultural traditions. They all play a powerful role in gut health. And the other is obviously the supplements that we'll talk about. And then the final thing we're going to talk about are the prebiotics. This is an important concept to begin to understand, which is that what the bacteria are consisting of in your gut, in other words, which ones are there, as well as how they're doing, has a lot to do with how we're feeding them. And the feeding of them is what prebiotics is all about. And we'll talk about that. Okay, before I get into the supplements, I just want to mention very quickly breast milk. Okay? I can't get enough about how amazing and elegant the human animal is and how well designed all of its functions are. In the process of doing the research necessary to speak to you today and in my prior lecture, one of the most fascinating details that I discovered is that a mother's breast milk contains over 1,000 molecules, most of them sugars, that are indigestible by baby. So that begs the question, why would mom invest the time and energy and DNA to know how to make sugars that baby can't consume? What's that all about? Well, those are the sugars that are the first prebiotics that human beings consume. It is literally as if mom is the constant gardener to her baby's gut. From the beginning, mom is helping that baby's gut end up with the kind of flora that's best suited for baby. This is why breastfeeding has, now that we're beginning to really fully understand it, why it is so critical to baby's health. There was a time when even in this country that formula, because of its consumer economic model, was being pushed in hospitals and in the offices of pediatricians. But there is nothing that human beings can create that can rival the elegance and completeness of breast milk. And I just found that fascinating, that the very first prebiotic that human beings get actually comes in the form of breast milk. Now, the next thing I want to emphasize is that anytime that you talk about probiotics, unless you're talking about colony-forming units of at least 10 to 15 billion, the dose is simply not enough to exert a physiologic effect. In other words, it will not confer any benefit to you. And the reason why you need such high counts of organisms is because 85% of them die during the journey across the barren, acidic tundra of the gut, of the stomach. And so a very small percentage of the consumed probiotics are actually going to get to the destination. What is the destination? The very end of the small intestine, and largely, or mostly I should say, in the large intestine. That's where we want to put these bacteria, but to get them there, they have to somehow survive the harshness of the acidic milieu of the stomach, and 85% do not. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about are two species that are particularly important. Anytime you're getting a probiotic supplement, you have to look and confirm that these two species are present. The first is lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is also very relevant, very pertinent in Greek yogurt and readily found there. But the interesting thing about lactobacillus, and by the way, everything I'm stating here has been supported by medical literature, by actual science. There are studies, albeit smaller studies, but there are studies that prove this, and if you are interested in the references to those, I'll be more than happy to provide them to you after this lecture. But the interesting thing about lactobacillus species is that they suppress the HPA axis. Remember that? The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. the end result of which is the overproduction of cortisol, which is the principal stress hormone that raises the level of inflammation in the body. So we want to suppress the HPA axis, and lactobacillus species do just that. And then the second principal player in the world of supplementing probiotics is the bifidobacteria species. These are interesting in that one of their functions, and there's multiple ones, but I've chosen one for the sake of brevity, is that they increase the levels of tryptophan. They help to manufacture and make more rapid the production of tryptophan. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid, and it is the principal building block of serotonin. So therefore, the more serotonin you have, the more tryptophan that you have, the more serotonin that you will have, the better your serotonin levels are in the brain, the less likely you are to be anxious or depressed. And so this is the connection that bifidarium has with that. Now, I want to take a quick moment and talk about, since I've referenced it, science or research or studies. Okay? I said this in my first lecture, I'll say it again, that in my opinion, the last true scientist was Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk, for those of you that do not know, invented or discovered the polio vaccine. And those of you that are old enough to have been alive during the polio epidemics know that this was an awful scourge on human beings. And it was an existential reality that every parent faced, that their child could come down with polio and end up paralyzed. And when Jonas Salk discovered the polio vaccine, in a very famous interview with Edgar Rice Burroughs, he was asked, "Are you going to patent it?" And Jonas Salk's response was, "Patent it? That would be as if I were to patent the sun." And he refused to patent the polio vaccine. And that might have been the last time that anyone did anything for the sake of the science. And since then, what we have in reality is a very sophisticated corporate revenue-generating system that is responsible for all the science that we engage in. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example of that. In 1998, a drug rep came to my office in Providence, Rhode Island, and she said, "Dr. Shah, I need a moment of your time because I want to discuss with you the importance of managing your patient's pain. And I want you to know that the consensus of thinkers and thought leaders across this country is that you need to treat pain as another vital sign. You have to ask about it every time the patient comes in, and after you've asked about it, if the patient tells you that they're in pain, it is your moral duty to treat their pain. And in order for you to treat that pain, I have a drug that is not addictive, has minimal side effects, and will treat your patient's pain. And I have a study to prove everything that I'm telling you." And she did. And that drug was OxyContin. And living now in the decade that we're living in, where more Americans every year are dying from opioid overdoses than they're dying from motor vehicle accidents on our highways, you can see what the consequences of that sort of science can be. And make no mistake about it, science had been done. Studies had been researched, and conclusions had been drawn that supported the statements that she made. So I want you to take science, and I want you to take the idea of research with a certain grain of salt, which is that science typically serves a master. And that master is usually $1. Science is no longer always serving our interests as human beings attempting to become better. And so when you hear someone say, "Well, Dr. Shah talks a lot about things that there's not a lot of research about." And that's true, there isn't. But that's because there's not a lot of money to be made out of yogurt. No one is going to generate $1 billion worth of kimchi every year. It's just never going to happen. And what that means for corporations is that they have zero interest in kimchi. They have zero interest in Greek yogurt. And so whatever truth may lie in any of these natural foodstuffs, we may never fully know because the science and the research and the expertise will never be applied to it. At least know that going in, is that when someone makes that rebuttal or makes that counter, that, well, at least when we prescribe you Prozac, there's a lot of studies to prove its efficacy and its safety. And we have no studies or not enough studies to prove the benefits of probiotics. Well, that may have more to do with which one of the two makes money than with regards to which one has more truth in it. Just know that going in. All right. So there was a head-to-head trial done for 30 days in patients who were suffering from anxiety. So patients come in, they report, I'm anxious, and this is a European trial in which they took half of this population and put them on diazepam, Valium. That's one of the heavy hitters. It's a benzodiazepine that can really take the edge off. So each one of these patients started getting 5 milligrams of Valium every day to treat their symptoms of anxiety. And the other half were given probiotics. And at the end of 30 days, through the form basically of a questionnaire, patients were asked about their levels of anxiety, and something startling happened, which is that both of them basically expressed the same levels of reduction in their anxiety. Now, again, the pharmaceutical companies don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear in a head-to-head trial that a prescription medication couldn't do any better than someone taking some healthy bacteria or eating a lot more Greek yogurt. But the reality is that in this one study, diazepam met its match with nothing more than probiotics. In the probiotic versus an antidepressant, these are patients that are clinically depressed. There was a study that compared Bifidarium infantis, which is one of the strains of the Bifidarium family that are important, and you should look for it in the probiotics that you consume, against escitalopram, which is in the same family of drugs that we've been talking the most about, the SSRIs. Okay? And escitalopram is something that over the years, hundreds of my patients have been placed upon. Okay? And in that comparative study, Bifidarium infantis performed as well as escitalopram in managing a patient's depressive symptoms. So there is some data now that is starting to build that is making a pretty compelling argument that to manage garden variety depression or anxiety, which remember, it's a third of my practice, that maybe it's time to look at it again, not through the scope or the prism of what kinds of pharmacologic agents are available and that I can use that may cause my patient to gain weight, may cause her sexual dysfunction, when in reality there may be probiotic treatments and therapies that may be just as effective. And now I want to wrap up by briefly mentioning another important element to how you treat your gut health and how you promote the growth of bacteria that are effective at combating mood disorders like anxiety and depression, and that's the world of prebiotics. And this is where if you're into functional medicine or if you're into other aspects of your health involving diet, you'll see that all of these elements fit in together beautifully, they interlock, which is that, look, whole unprocessed foods, there's a bazillion reasons why that's better than processed and refined foods. But it's in the whole unprocessed foods that we are delivering to our guts the essential building blocks that enable our gut bacteria to metabolize the short-chain fatty acids that we so desperately need, to metabolize other precursors to neurotransmitters that we need. And so a diet that is rich in that is important. Plant-based diets are critical. Why? Because essentially, and you can kind of see our evolution, we had to have at some point been virtually dependent on plant-based diets. And that's because our gut bacteria have evolved to do a lot with the cellulose and other forms of oligosaccharides that are not digestible by the human gut, and the gut bacteria take it and use it for their own energy needs, and along the way manufacture molecules and compounds that are of great benefit to human health. So having plant life, having a plant-based diet, at least with 70% of your diet being plant-based, is critical to providing your gut with the prebiotics that it needs Omega-3 oils, we had talked about that. Monounsaturated fats like the kinds that are found in olive oil, and then finally medium-chain triglycerides like the kind found in oils like coconut oil are all types of prebiotics that promote the growth of healthy bacteria. Growing healthy bacteria in our gut has to become one of the mainstays of how we combat the stresses of life and how we combat the conditions of both depression and anxiety. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'm going to open this conversation up to where we can ask each other questions and we can add comments as we like. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Something you just said, 70% of the diet should be plant-based minimum. When you say 70%, are you saying 70% of calorie intake or like 70% of like the space on your plate?
70% of the space on your plate. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the plant that you consume doesn't get factored into your caloric consumption. And it doesn't matter because those aren't calories for you. They're like those 1,000 molecules that are contained in breast milk. Baby doesn't ever get to enjoy them. And it doesn't matter because those are specifically designed to feed the gut microbiome of the developing infant. Yep. Shelley?
The mentioning of the sauerkraut and kimchi, is it important that it's raw or can you have it cooked?
So that's a great question. Even with respect to sauerkraut, the sauerkraut that you can buy at Fry's won't cut it. And that's because that one has been basically soaked in vinegar, which is acetic acid, and that kills the fermented bacteria that have been growing in that substance. So you want to have natural pre-soaking in any kind of acidic sauerkraut, and you can get that at Whole Foods. Kimchi similarly comes fermented, but if you cook it, the chances are good that you're killing off your bacteria. So you want to eat your fermented foods without cooking them. Yes, sir.
Pickles okay?
What's that?
Pickles or no?
Yeah, there's a variety of pickled foodstuffs throughout civilizations across the world that are fermented and will contain bacteria. Yeah.
Probiotic supplements, like you were saying, like the pill, like we give our daughter like a vitamin.
Yes.
Is that equally well absorbed or?
As food?
Yeah.
So, a couple of things. One, I recommend routinely that the probiotics that you get be refrigerated at the point of sale so that you're not getting them off of room temperature shelves because we know that the counts go down dramatically when that's the case. That's first and foremost. Number two, the supplement industry is unregulated. So we're talking about things in the theory. The reality is that where these supplements are made, with what kind of rigor are the quality controls being implemented is not clear. So I'm not sure if the gesture alone, you have to really kind of work with your daughter and to see if there's whatever benefit you're hoping to confer to her. If it's not getting there, it's time to change the brand. It's time to change maybe whether it was refrigerated or not, whether it's solid versus liquid, because there's liquid forms. And the one thing that you can always rely on are the fermented foods. And so I recommend that it's important to supplement with the probiotics, but you cannot underestimate the importance of taking in kimchi or sauerkraut or the yogurts, because those you can fairly rely upon as having active cultures.
Anything on gluten and why now we see so much gluten sensitivity and gluten allergy, and if there's any relevance to the microbiome?
There's a whole lecture that is coming. This is a great way to segue towards that. But one of the things that modern human beings are struggling with is the inability to distinguish between friend and foe. It's something that our immune system has been entrusted to do since time immemorial and has done a tremendous job of it. And then suddenly, Within the last 50 years, we're finding that there are schools where you can't take any peanut product to because there's a child in that school who will have a life-threatening reaction to peanuts. As a child of the 70s into the early 80s, I can't imagine that there's a school without a peanut butter jelly sandwich in it because it was such a staple, and yet that's a reality now. My sister, who's the daughter of 2 Punjabi parents, and just so for those of you who don't know, Punjabis, their subsistence is wheat. They come from a part of the world where the principal grain that they raise and consume is wheat. They eat it every day. And my grandparents and my great-grandparents and their parents and so on and so forth, all of them literally could not have survived in the basin of the Punjab without consuming wheat. Now have a great-great-great-granddaughter who has, of her 5 sons, 3 that have a gluten intolerance. How in God's name can that happen? How can the child of an entire line of people that were entirely dependent on wheat now suddenly have nearly a death-like response to the consumption of anything that has wheat in it? I mean, this should really be not just a medical condition that we're treating, it should be a moment to stop and say, what is happening? How is this possible? How can we go in one generation from parents that still are eating wheat-based bread on a daily basis to a child who now has 3 of her 5 children that cannot take in any form of wheat whatsoever? And they're meticulously looking at the ingredients of every product because gluten is such a rampant addition to essentially all kinds of food that they have to deal with this reality now. And so why is that? It has more to do with your immune function and dysfunction than anything else. And that's why you're seeing autoimmune diseases like Hashimoto's thyroiditis becoming so rampant. It's the immune system's inability to distinguish between friend and foe, and ultimately between self. And where does the immune system get its training in terms of how to behave? In the gut. And that's because 80% of your immune system resides along the gut. We haven't talked about that as much because for today's conversation, that wasn't as pertinent. But for one of the next lectures, it's highly pertinent that your immune system's undergrad, graduate school, postgraduate training all occurs in the gut. And if that training, which is dependent on its relationship with the bacteria that exist in the gut, if somehow that has become dysfunctional because of gut dysbiosis, then that immune system has a problem. It has somehow been mutated and doesn't always know when to stop firing. You know, we talk about friendly fire in war settings. This is where troops, men and women that are on the front lines, because of stressors, they sometimes end up shooting each other. And it's common. This is not like a once in a while aberration. This is a reality, and it's because of the levels of stress put on them. You can take that analogy and apply it to the immune system, which is that because of the extraordinary stressors that are being placed on our immune system because of gut dysbiosis, that immune system is not functioning properly. There are people with skin allergies, there are people with environmental allergies, there are people with autoimmune diseases that had they been born in a time before the age of antibiotics and processed sugars would have never had that problem. And one of the things that I struggle with as a proud American is that I want to be proud of where I live. I'm so blessed to live here, but what if some of my patients are going to die 10 years early because they lived here as opposed to a third world country where they might have had other issues to face, but they wouldn't have had rheumatoid arthritis, they wouldn't have had lupus, or they wouldn't have had other conditions that are really destroying the quality of their life. And so I always tell my patients that, look, we live in the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. Let us enjoy it, but let us not be victims of it. And one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today is to begin an honest dialogue, an authentic dialogue to say, look, What are the things that are happening in the way that we are as Americans that is causing disease, that is causing our early demise, or even if it's not our early demise, but it's that the quality of our life is being taken away from us. You know, I have people coming in every day to my office complaining of irritable bowel syndrome, and they're usually on medications to treat the symptoms. And I ask them, has anyone discussed with you gut dysbiosis? No. And after we have the conversation and I implement a detox, in 90% of the cases, what I see is that patients that tell me that they had IBS no longer have it. Patients that tell me that they have lactose intolerance or a lactose allergy, can't consume dairy because of an allergy, actually don't. So in my experience over the last 22 years, so much of what I've been treating is actually coming back to this idea of gut health. So all of those questions are fitting beautifully into the same.
Can I have another question?
Yes.
Do you guys refer patients to have fecal transplant? And I know that there's a lot of, centers now, they take it seriously, treating, special conditions like intractable C. diff colitis and etc.
So Dr. Atala is asking the question about what is the role of fecal transplant. For those of you that are not familiar with that means, essentially taking the stool of a volunteer, turning it into an elixir, and introducing it into the gut of the patient in order to remedy certain diseases. The only one that the FDA approves that particular treatment to be used, and only in specialized centers, is in the infection of intractable C. diff or Clostridia difficile colitis. My own personal viewpoint is that in 25 years, we will be transplanting gut flora from healthy subjects to those that have a variety of conditions with great success. That's going to happen. This is a topic that we haven't addressed today, but I can tell you this: how you look, how much you weigh may have as much to do with the constituents of your gut as much as it does about your self-control or about what you eat and how much of it that you eat. There's a lot of unnecessary shaming that we do as Americans on the routine about how we appear, and that we always attribute that to personal conduct. And what we are now beginning to learn is that it has as much to do with the constituents of your gut flora as it has to do with your ability to choose your food wisely or have portion control. Conditions that we generally judge people over, like you have poor self-control, that's why you're obese. And I think the reality is far more complicated than that and may have a lot more to do with, again, your gut flora. And so I think that there have been studies already done using mice where they have a population of mice that are lean and a population of mice that they have purposely fed and made obese. And then what they've done is they've taken those populations, removed all of their gut flora, and they can do that using high-dose antibiotics. And then they've actually transplanted from the lean to the obese mouse and found that the obese mouse becomes lean. Still has access to the same amount of food, but becomes lean. And so there's a lot that's going to be unpacked here, a lot that's going to be unraveled, I suspect over the next quarter of a century. I think there's going to come a time, ladies and gentlemen, when you present to a healthcare provider's office, the first thing that she's going to ask you is for a stool sample, and they're going to catalog everything that's there, and then they're going to tell you that there's 8 strains missing and 4 that shouldn't be there. And the first thing that we're going to do to treat whatever condition it is that you presented with is we're going to add the 8 that were missing, and we're going to eliminate the 4 that shouldn't be there. And I don't know yet exactly what the techniques will be to do that, but I am certain that that is going to happen and that it is going to profoundly alter the way that we view disease, and more importantly for me as a provider, how we treat disease.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Since I started this fermented cabbage and kimchi, I wanted to find a Korean person and ask him all these questions. So my question to you, since you know all this,
do they have a lesser disease body? I mean, do they not get sick like we do with all our yuck stuff that we get?
Well, I think that generally speaking, what you have to think of when you think of populations suffering from similar is industrialization. Wherever there's industrialization, the disease profile begins to become very familiar and similar. Now, I'll give you an example. In India, before it became industrialized, coronary artery disease was virtually unknown. And now, because their diets are starting to reflect the diets of other industrialized nations, coronary artery disease there has become rampant. So the same genes, the same people weren't having coronary artery disease, which in America is the #1 killer. Now they're rivaling it within just 40 years. So it has less to do with where the person is from as opposed to the nature of how the society is set up. If it's mimicking Western industrialized nations, societies, it's going to have a similar disease profile. If those populations are more rural, if they're still eating food that is, my wife and I were in Kenya over Thanksgiving, and one of the things that was surprising was that in a city the size of Nairobi, people still eat fresh meat. The idea of going to a big grocery store where meat comes from some remote farm where it was grown using industrial techniques that involve antibiotics and then killed, processed, and packaged, and it just shows up in a counter somewhere, it's still foreign to them. And so this is a nation that's still relying on unprocessed foods, and as a result of that, they're doing a lot better than we are in a lot of respects. One of the things that I always find fascinating, and I know it sounds strange, but I always ask about people's bowel health wherever I go. I always ask, how often do you go to the bathroom? What does it look like? Is it well-formed? And the answer that I always get from every third world country that I've visited is that every one of them has a well-formed rope-like stool bowel movement every day. And when I tell them that I have patients, some of whom don't go to the bathroom for 3 to 5 days, I've never seen people look more shocked. Like they're like, how can that person be alive? How could you carry that inside of you for 5 days before you moved your bowels? And I have to look at them and think, we've normalized that here. You know, there are people that don't go to the bathroom every day here, and we think, well, that's just the way you are, it's okay. And yet here's a whole civilization where every single person that I ask is just like mortally shocked by it. And by the way, these are also communities and societies where colon cancer is virtually unknown. No one's doing a colonoscopy on Africans at the age of 50 or Indians or Pakistanis at the age of 50. They don't need to. Nobody there knows what diverticulitis is. I can tell you there are people in this hall right now that know personally what diverticulitis is. It's just the reality of our lifestyle and what it is that's in our gut is having a profound impact on the kinds of conditions that I, as an American physician, have to become familiar with. I don't know anything about malaria. When we went there, my wife was like, we should take some pills. I said, I have to think about this. And I ended up not taking it because we weren't going to go into a rural area, but I had to read about malaria because I saw it once in Brooklyn. And that wasn't a person who had come over from Africa. But I know a lot about colon cancer. I know a lot about diverticulitis. I know a lot about heart disease. I know a lot about rheumatologic conditions and autoimmune conditions and funky allergies and rashes, because those are the things that providers like Kayla and I see day in, day out. That comprises our practice. Yes?
I've spent 62 years trying to figure out my unhealthy gut, and have had many diagnoses throughout the years, and the last being the gluten diagnosis and celiacs. And many people in my family have had the test and come up, the DNA test, and know it's DNA, so I got off of gluten, still having problems. Went over to Europe and had the good fortune of staying with someone who lived by a bakery that has been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, a brewery where it came from the monks, and I didn't have a problem with anything. Got back to the airport, ate a sandwich, and had diarrhea. So I just wonder if you've heard any other stories like that where if you you know, the changing genetics of our grains and how it affects your gut? And
Well,
how does that play
it's
into
not so
all of
much our
this?
changing genetics. There's a couple of problems with wheat as we know it. It's one, been genetically modified. And when big corporations like Monsanto change the genetic makeup of a staple like wheat, they're doing it for particular reasons. But we're not God. So it's like that Jurassic Park kind of scenario where people are always doing things for all the right reasons. You always have the best of intentions, but you know what? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so we've created products that can withstand a famine. And so you could argue, well, nobody's dying of a wheat famine anymore because now the plant is so much hardier. That may be true, but somehow along the way we have introduced into the genetic makeup of wheat and the husk, the gluten that covers it, we've introduced something that wasn't meant to be there. It's something that had never gotten in there throughout the millennia that we've had a relationship with wheat. Because think about this, since at least the time of the ancient Egyptians, we've had a profound relationship with wheat. Wheat is not a new carb. This is one of our oldest carbs. And so somewhere, despite all of millions and millions of humanity that had been exposed to wheat, we've now created a version of it that is creating these profound disease states. My sister literally and her sons, they look haggard all the time. And it's because every once in a while, they get a little bit of gluten from something that they didn't know about. And that's all it takes to set them off for weeks at a time. And so part of it is the genetics, and then there's another wild card, which is the use of pesticides and other chemical agents in order to preserve our wheat supply. And we're doing that again for, I suppose, the right reasons. But when you do that either to make more money or to feed more people, but inadvertently, you are creating a kind of wheat that is intolerable to a significant number of people. And so the mass production of things is a huge problem. It's not the way that food was meant to be sourced. That's clear to me. It just isn't. And it's not that big countries and big populations can't do it. It's that Americans are accustomed to having their food whenever they want it, and they also are accustomed to having it be cheap. And if you think about it, food is so ridiculous. I mean, my son sometimes will come back from Chick-fil-A with enough food to feed an army, and it hardly costs anything in the grand scheme of things. And you have to look at that and go, this kid, this teenager, can go there and buy all the food that he wants for a few bucks. Food just shouldn't be that cheap. We have driven the price of food down to such a point where now anything can pass as an excuse for food. And that's part of the problem, is that we as a society, as a people, we've accepted that. The idea that it has to be nurtured and gardened and tended to, and it's something that should be really valued. We don't have that relationship with food anymore, and we're paying the dividends for it.
Is it safe to consume raw fish, your gut?
Is raw fish safe to consume with regards to the gut? Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a long and storied tradition, particularly in the Pacific Rim, of people doing it. This is not a new fad. It may be for some of us in America, but the idea of eating raw fish is well established with civilizations.
Is there a way to turn around, like in the case of your sister and this lady over here, a more natural-based food, like your sister could, I don't know, buy a special grain with your bread? I mean, is there a way to reverse that?
I think so. I think that there is, and I think we just heard an illustration of it. I think if you're able to, so one of the things that I'm interested in is going to some of the primitive villages in the Punjab and getting seed from the locals that didn't get it from a corporation. It's been coming down through that particular house. I want that seed, and I want to grow it. And I want to grow it in a place that isn't going to be anywhere near where Monsanto's at work, because their pollen ends up contaminating even the good strains. But I would love to go to somewhere in the middle of Colorado and have a little bit of land and plant that wheat there and then make you some bread and see what happens. Because my suspicion is that she's going to enjoy that bread and her stomach is going to be happy with it.
Do you think that's why there's such success with Asian grains now, the variation of them, you know?
Yes.
Because people are straying from
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of things that in the rush to modernity and convenience that we have left behind. And now, as deeper wisdom is starting to settle in, we're realizing that not so fast. There was a lot more to that food stuff than we had ever imagined. And we are coming full circle. The fact that we're having this conversation today, that there's 50 people here interested enough in how the human gut microbiome may impact your mental health, just tells us that we're starting to think about connections that literally 10, 15 years ago, people would have labeled me a charlatan and rushed me out of town. What are you talking about? Depression? And there's a bacteria in your gut that causes it? But now this is the new paradigm, and we're rapidly ramping up our knowledge within this paradigm. And I think it's a very exciting time. It's an exciting time to be a practitioner now. The one thing that I fear is that this entire conversation did not include a product that is worth billions to anybody. And so there's going to be some inertia to advance this, because you have to remember something. Science does not evolve. Science is a series of revolutions. It has to destroy the old model to adopt the new model. There is no genteel passing of the baton, like, you got me on this one. You know, depression isn't what I thought it was. Well, here you go. Good luck to you, good sir. Continue the quest for knowledge. That's not how it happens. There's a guy with his name on a chapter in a textbook who's saying, I get a lot of money from that textbook, and I got a full professorship at Harvard with that. I'm not about to let somebody in a half-broken conference room tell people that it's just about the bacteria in your gut. Like, that is just not going to happen. It is going to have to be a model that gets destroyed and replaced with a new way of thinking about really everything about our health. We'll see how it goes. The corporations certainly are going to stand in the way of it, but I'm hopeful that truth will prevail.
Is it true that in Europe, genetically modified and engineered foods are not allowed, so all of the fruits and vegetables?
They've taken positions, again, because these civilizations still have an appreciation for food that we lack. That their food source for them is of profound importance. I was in the Caribbean many years ago as a younger man, and I bought a loaf of bread from one of the local bakeries, and I took it back to my little bungalow that I had overlooking a cove, and I ate a couple of slices, and I left the rest of the loaf on the shelf. I came back the next day, and it had some mold on it, and I was outraged. I took the remaining part of that loaf, and I ran it back down to that store owner, and I put it on his counter, and I said, I want a refund. And he said, why? I said, because it grew mold. He said, you're an American, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. He said, you're so accustomed to eating a bread that has been so laced with preservatives that no organism other than you wants to eat it. And you take pride in the fact that you can eat it for weeks at a time. I made you a fresh loaf of bread using nothing other than wheat and butter and a few other simple ingredients like eggs. And it is so delicious that, yes, the mold wanted. He said, let the mold have some of it. Take off the mold and eat it. And you know what? I did. And I've lived to tell the tale. So there's a lot that we have accepted in the way that our food is prepared for us that shouldn't be accepted. All right, well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. Thank you.